The Cloverfield Paradox. The film follows a group of astronauts who are on a space station ironically called Cloverfield, who are out in space trying to figure out how they can harness a new form of energy for the planet because the world's natural resources are almost completely done and dusted. And if they can harness this energy, they may be able to create a new unlimited source of energy for the entire planet. However, when these astronauts finally figure out how to harness this energy, they accidentally transport themselves to another dimension, and as you can imagine, some weird stuff happens along the way. Yippee. I really wanted to like this film. I really did. I'm a huge fan of the first Cloverfield movie, which is one of my favourite monster movies, and its sequel slash not sequel, 10 Cloverfield Lane, being one of my favourite thrillers. Plus, I love these types of movies. Movies that are set in claustrophobic environments, which in that sense does make it kind of similar to Alien. But to put it short, I did not like the Cloverfield Paradox. When I initially watched the film, it was hard for me to really comprehend what I thought about the movie, but then the more I thought about it, the more I began to dislike it. Just to be clear, I didn't completely hate this movie. There are some legitimately good things about the film that keep it from being a total disaster that I will mention throughout the video, but unfortunately those pros aren't enough to really make me dismiss all the problems I have with this movie. To start off with, I'm going to talk about my biggest issue with this movie. There are plenty of other things that I didn't like about Paradox, but this issue really derailed the experience for me. You see, the Cloverfield Paradox is supposed to be the movie that ties together Cloverfield and 10 Cloverfield Lane, in effect making the franchise feel whole. It's even marketed as the film that will do that exact thing, but the movie itself is actually very unclear on that front. Now don't get me wrong, I love movies that create intrigue and mystery because those types of movies keep you thinking even after the credits roll. Unfortunately, the Cloverfield Paradox doesn't accomplish that. While the movie does try to create those things, it comes off as very silly and it creates more confusion in doing so. There are so many theories you can make to either knock this film down or defend it for what it's trying to do, but the film is just filled to the brim with very unnecessary elements. For example, the scene where a character is watching a news broadcast featuring an author talking about his book and his fears about the possibilities of multiple dimensions colliding. I really wish they hadn't included that scene because it basically ruins the reveal that because the experiment goes wrong, the crew of this space station and the space station itself have been transported to another dimension. If we didn't know about that before it even happened, then that reveal would have been 100 times more effective. There's also the ending of this film that just doesn't make any sense to me, at all. Particularly when you look at the first Cloverfield movie. So when the last two surviving characters escape the ship after they get back to their own dimension, their escape pod crashes down through the clouds, but then seconds later, the Cloverfield monster bursts up through the clouds. But there's one problem. If I remember correctly, the Cloverfield monster in the first movie wasn't even as tall as New York's biggest skyscrapers. So how is it now tall enough to burst through the clouds? This could mean that this is another dimension where this dimension's monsters are just taller than the freaking clouds apparently, or what we're seeing here is a fully grown Cloverfield monster and the monster we see in the first film is actually a baby. But can we confirm that? No, we can't. This movie doesn't even take the time to explain this, or even reveal where exactly this Cloverfield monster came from. Instead, we have J.J. Abrams going and saying that this Cloverfield monster is apparently the same one from the first movie, but from what I can tell, that makes no sense. Does the monster have some sort of dimension-hopping power that we don't know about? Does he just jump from one dimension to another to wreak havoc? How does that work? At the end of the first movie, if you look really closely, you can see a satellite fall into the ocean. If you blink, you'll miss it. It's very hard to spot on first viewing. But that was what was meant to await the Cloverfield monster in the first film. In Paradox, it looks like they're showing us that exact event, but the thing is, the monster in Paradox appears immediately after the satellite breaks through the clouds, possibly even before it hits the ocean. But in the first movie, the monster didn't surface until way after the satellite fell into the ocean, and once again, in the first movie, he's not taller than the clouds. This movie has done more to mess up this timeline than take any time to answer questions we may have had coming out of the first two films. In the end of 10 Cloverfield Lane, we find out that there is actually an alien invasion going on. There's not even a mention of the Cloverfield monster. We don't even see it, which confused a lot of people, including myself. But now Paradox is here, and apparently every film now takes place in a different timeline or dimension, and that would be a cool way to tie these movies together if they'd further developed it in this film. Paradox basically makes it even harder to understand where any of these movies even fit into this timeline. It's just become so incredibly hard to understand what happens, when it happens, and who it happens to. And because now the concept of multiple dimensions has come into play, I just can't figure it out. If paradox happens in this dimension, does the 2008 Cloverfield take place in a different one or an earlier timeline? And if that's the case, where does 10 Cloverfield Lane fit into all of this? And if paradox is just another dimension with its own Cloverfield monster, do all of these take place in different universes or timelines? Or, you know what, this is where my brain just goes static. When they actually get stuck in another dimension, I thought maybe the dimension they accidentally travel to is the dimension that the first film took place in, and I was thinking, that is legitimately clever. But then the film would cut back to another character on the Cloverfield paradox dimension, and the Cloverfield monster is running around the city, which made me think, oh, so paradox is set in the same dimension as the first movie? But the character they keep cutting back to who's on the paradox Earth with that Cloverfield monster has a modern day smartphone, and I was immediately thrust into a whirlpool of confusion. People still had flip phones in 2008. You even see one of the characters in the first movie using one. And again, you can make theories to defend this film. The problem is that none of these occurrences have an explanation. We never learn how the Cloverfield monster can exist in one or two different dimensions, and how it apparently doesn't exist or doesn't seem to be there in 10 Cloverfield Lane. I think the concept of having these movies take place across multiple dimensions could have been cool, but because of the way they handle the concept in this film, they've pretty much screwed up the timeline. Now it's impossible for me to interpret how these films even connect with each other, because so many things happen in this movie that screw up the timeline. Now I don't even see how 10 Cloverfield Lane even fits in, let alone relates to the other two films, because outside of the title, it has nothing to do with them. This movie is supposed to be the tie-in movie that connects this franchise together and gives it an actual continuity. It did not do that. However, the problems with the Cloverfield paradox don't just stop at the connection between the other two movies. Even if you look at this movie as its own standalone story with no connection to the other Cloverfield movies whatsoever, it still doesn't make any sense. For example, there is a scene in which one of the characters is fixing a part of the space station when all of a sudden the wall of the ship seems to come alive and the wall engulfs this guy's arm and almost pulls him inside the wall, and when it actually finally lets him go, his arm is just gone, it's nowhere to be seen, and I did think for a second, okay, that was pretty cool. I'll even say that the sequence itself is actually very well executed, and it's one of the better parts of the movie. Then out of nowhere, this guy's hand appears, and now it has a mind of its own. I kid you not, this thing was like a really messed up version of Thing from the Addams Family. But how does this arm now have a mind of its own? Do we even get an answer to that question? Nope. It just shows up, writes something down, and then the characters just never acknowledge this thing again. In fact, after it serves its purpose in the film, it disappears from the movie entirely. We never get any payoff or revelation as to how it came back with a mind of its own, or if not that, who or what was controlling it. That's just one example of multiple things that happen throughout this movie that just don't make any sense. The way that these dimensions work doesn't really make sense either. It's heavily implied throughout the film that because these people don't belong in this dimension is trying to get rid of them. It's trying to erase them from its space. It seems to be the space station seemingly coming alive and trying to kill every member of the crew in gruesome and horrible ways. But at one point in the film, the dimension seemingly influences one of the crew members to try and kill off two of his crew members. If that's the case, why didn't it just influence them all to kill each other, rather than using the space station to kill them by engulfing their arms or using weird metallic tentacles to grab them, and basically mess them up? There's so many times where you think this dimension would influence the materials in this space station to kill off these characters in some form or another, but it just doesn't. So what about the characters? They gotta be good, right? Well, for the most part, not really. The only person I actually cared about was Gugu Mbatha Raw's character. She has a very tragic past involving the death of her children, and when she ends up in another dimension where she finds out they are alive, she contemplates over the idea of maybe staying in this dimension. Those scenes were pretty interesting, and I dare say I absolutely loved what was done with this character in that regard. Everyone else, on the other hand, while everyone in this insane cast does a great job of what they have, none of these characters are given as much development or personality as Gugu Mbatha Raw's character. Outside of the main character, they're all so bland and forgettable that they feel like nothing more than bystanders waiting for their turn to get killed off in some way or another. And that's a real shame because they clearly have amazing chemistry together. but good performances and strong chemistry don't make good characters. A lot of them are very poorly written as well. Like, for example, the ship's doctor, who for some reason doesn't have the guts to perform surgery on a dead body despite the fact that he is apparently a medical professional, and there are scenes where the characters literally walk up to things that are clearly dangerous, like they're freaking zombies, and idiotically get themselves killed. I would just like to mention that this is a crew of scientists aboard this space station who were selected to save the world. Yup. The scenes that take place on Earth could have been really cool, but unfortunately, aside from some admittedly pretty cool imagery, they feel very abrupt and shockingly out of place. Aside from one very impressive shot of someone looking into the distance where he sees the shadow of a giant monster amidst the smoke, they add nothing. They feel like filler, scenes that were just thrown in there to fill up the runtime, like they were added in at the last minute. While I wouldn't call the Cloverfield Paradox a good movie by any stretch, there was clearly a good amount of effort put into this movie. For starters, it's visually stunning. The space station itself looks staggering, the sets are really well put together, and the directing by Julius Onah is outstanding. There are a lot of really cool shots in this movie as well, and to put it short, it's simply a very good looking movie. Overall, it's a very respectably well made film, and I really hate it when talent like this is wasted on a poorly written script. It just feels like such a missed opportunity. It's a rushed script. That's one of the main problems with this movie, and as a result of this, everything else suffers. Most of the characters are about as dimensionless as you can get, the story is convoluted and baffling, and the connection between the other films is virtually non-existent. Although that last part may have something to do with the fact that this film had already begun shooting before J.J. Abrams came in and turned it into a Cloverfield movie. By the way, that last part was not a joke, that actually happened. To conclude, the Cloverfield Paradox is not a good movie because of basically everything I've just said in this video. The first two movies, in my opinion, are clever and well thought out pieces of cinema that each explore different concepts and genres. The Cloverfield Paradox tries to do the same thing, but it fails spectacularly. If when the other movies that are supposedly coming out answer the questions that this movie still left unanswered, and in turn maybe answer the questions that this movie creates, and possibly find a way to make it all feel like one continuity, then maybe, just maybe, I might be able to look at the Cloverfield Paradox as a decent film. But right now, it's pretty plain and simple. The Cloverfield Paradox sucks.